Thank you so much, Binoy, and to the Literary Society of Aryabhatta College for inviting me here today. It's such a joy to be in DU, if only in its cyberspace in the month of February, the loveliest of months in Delhi, awash in flowering trees and university festivals, especially literary. And it is particularly wonderful to be in the company of the speakers of this international conference, all of whom personify the fabulous meeting of the critical academic and the creative writer, to whom all the world's a page and all the men and women merely ink. And I use the word fabulously deliberately, something extraordinary, having no basis in reality, mythical, to bring us to the theme I want to focus on today. Much of my work as an academic has focused on the body and physical violence, thinking especially how these bodies are gendered in the context of different kinds of violence that is done to them, how this violence is narrated, and why so many of these narratives use non-realist, magic realist, or otherwise fabulous strategies. Over the many years, the last few years, I have concentrated on issues of gender, most recently having immersed myself in the millions of stories that are part of the movement against sexual harassment and abuse. Meanwhile, almost all of my fiction has been in the genres of fantasy and speculative or science fiction. And so in this presentation, I would like to find ways of thinking about how and maybe even why fictional narratives of the violenced woman's body reinscribe the patriarchal ideologies that make these bodies vulnerable to such violence. I want to explain quickly that I use the word violenced instead of violated or mutilated, because those terms carry their own sort of baggage of ideology behind them. And I just want to focus entirely on the idea of physical violence done to the body, hence violence. But more than this, I want to think about how it is that this seems to happen in texts where we would least expect it, perhaps even in ways in which the authors themselves would not approve of in the context of their fiction. If the woman's body is a story that men tell each other, how should we critically read fictional narratives that, in spite of all that we can gather about the author's politics and intentions to the contrary, produce a twice abused body? A body abused first in the ideologies that script a certain kind of violence against it, and second, in the sympathetic writer's fictional inscription. Let me begin with two instances of this double inscription. Both are taken from novels by writers whom I greatly admire, both for their politics and for their literary skills. The first is from Isabel Allende's House of Spirits. So, briefly put, Alba, who is a pro democracy demonstrator, is taken prisoner by General Pinochet's guards, by whom she is beaten, tortured, and raped. When she is released, she finds that she is pregnant, but in spite of her conservative pro-Pinochet grandfather's urging, she decides not to abort the child. And the novel ends with the conservative grandfather and the liberal Alba awaiting the birth of the child together. The second example is from J.M. Coetzee's novel Disgrace, set in post-apartheid South Africa, and is quite similar. There is a conservative white father whose liberal daughter runs a farm co-owned and manned by Black South African men. The father is constantly advising his daughter to leave the farm, come to the city, since, according to him, the Black men on her farm are angry with white landowners and therefore very likely to attack her. The daughter keeps refusing to leave, saying that this is her land too and that she trusts the men. When she is raped by them, she refuses to identify them to the police, maintaining that to do so would only be to continue the long historical cycle of vengeance and violence that caused the men to rape her in the first place. She wishes instead to put an end to this cycle by neither seeking vengeance against the men nor justice for herself. Further, in spite of her father's urging, she decides not to abort the resulting pregnancy. And at the end of the novel, again, conservative father and liberal daughter await the birth of the child together. These are just two examples of this trope, and as can be seen for the purposes of the novels, this trope works quite well in analogical ways. As with the Pinochet dictatorship with the pro-democracy forces in Chile, history demands and has shown that the white and the black populations of South Africa have only ever come together in violence. And this is represented by the rape of the woman, who is the culture bearer and represents the land and the battered spirit of the country in this analogy. The future of these societies, represented by the unborn child, is not necessarily a happy or a bright one, but it is the only possible one and is awaited with fortitude and some hope by both liberal and conservative sides, and possibly by the author. As an ending to novels that explore such historically violent conflicts, this analogy is politically neat and aesthetically satisfying. Violence and a legacy of violence is seen to be transformed into the possibility of a future as yet innocent of the sins of its father, nurtured by the forgiveness and fortitude of its mother, whose brutal victimhood is transmuted into agency. As happy an ending as is possible under the circumstances, so where then is the problem? So it's worth remembering that the peculiar poignancy of this trope derives from its literal facticity. Women in ethnic, national, religious, and other armed conflicts the world over are raped as much to reap the political capital of the possible child as in violent vengeance to redress perceived grievances. The child, if it is born, is this vengeance made flesh. It derives its power from not just its literal identity, but perhaps more profoundly from its symbolic identity. Raping the woman instead of killing her is to lay claim to the future reality that might emerge from her womb. In the course of ethnic conflict, where nationalist and religious forces are dominant, women are raped as an act of war by men on both sides. To force the Muslim woman to produce a Hindu child or the Christian woman a Muslim child, and to plant one of your own kind in the enemy's territory, both as land and as his woman's body. This is the ultimate revenge and, of course, the ultimate victory. The woman's body as literal and metaphorical territory, the possible child as manifest as well as symbolic vengeance, seamlessly enter the fiction writer's imagination as metaphor and fictionalized history at once. And it's this seamlessness that I wish to focus, a seamlessness that language adopts and reproduces through devices such as symbolism and magic realism. In doing so, I want to argue, there is a very real danger that it produces also the social, cultural, and political forces that make such a crime possible in the first place. The symbolism that surrounds the woman's body, investing it against the woman's will and consent with meaning and value derived from patriarchal and nationalist social structures and ideologies, is reinvented and perpetuated through the use of this literary trope. But further, the woman's victimhood, produced by the narrative as agency, is used to serve the ideologies that perpetrated it in the first place. So the trope works to invest the unborn child with the symbolic power of the future. Not, as I've said, necessarily a bright one, but certainly one that bears the responsibility to lay to rest a violent past. In choosing to give birth to the child, the woman is making what is, in essence, a historically compelled choice to end the cycle of violence by either not accusing the rapist, as in Coetzee novel Disgrace, or by not aborting the unborn child, as in The House of Spirits. The unborn child, which must remain unborn in order to adequately figure an unseen future, represents a future in which warring factions will be necessarily, even organically, united. Both Allende's context of the state and the militant rebel and Coetzee's context of post-apartheid racist South Africa demand such a future as the only desirable one. Yet, historically, we know this trope to be a completely inaccurate representation of the actual political power or agency allowed to women not holding political office. No mere raped woman can stop armed national or racial conflict or history itself by any action of her choosing, whether it be to seek vengeance and abort the child or accept the injustice and carry the child. This trope, therefore, is hardly a realistic one in this sense of the agency of the woman. The main thrust and efficacy of this trope lies clearly in its aesthetic appeal. its ability to play upon or otherwise exploit a symbology that has proved repeatedly to be destructive in the most violent manner of every conceivable aspect of the woman's being and body. But we know, do we not, that in this rewriting of the story that men tell each other, the power to end such a material thing as doing violence to the woman's body in the course of ethnic violence lies precisely in acknowledging the symbolic implications of both the crime and the decision to keep the child, where the conflict between dictatorship and socialism is fought on the body of the rebel, or where the subjugation of one race by another is defined by the racially marked body itself, the violence can only be put to rest if this inscription, this investing of the body with symbolic meaning can be dismantled. And who better to undo one script by writing another one than a writer, after all? Indeed, such a kind of dismantling is a kind of activism that the literary writer is uniquely equipped and positioned to undertake. The writer arms herself with the power to rethink, refigure, and retell history and its compulsions. The writer has, in other words, a unique agency and opportunity to present a body free of patriarchal inscriptions, to write the woman's body into an agency, if you will, that can determine its own meaning and symbolism. In the two examples I've discussed, however, I see this transference of agency onto the violenced woman in an extremely problematic way. The woman to whom violence has been done, who even within the realist context of the plot has absolutely no such power, is invested with agency by the author and given the power to put an end to and right historical wrongs. And it's precisely here, I think, that it is important to focus the problems inherent in any trope that seeks to transform victimhood into a species of heroism or agency through the further self-mutilation or destruction of the victim herself. Such a rhetoric of heroism camouflages all too neatly the fruition of the most destructive form of patriarchy, forcing the woman to shoulder the burden of righting a wrong perpetrated by men and systems beyond her control through the further abuse and sacrifice of herself. That these tropes should be used so powerfully in texts that struggle to avoid these patriarchal, conservative, nationalist ideologies is, I think, an index to their literal truth. The thousands of women to be thus assaulted who have no recourse but to bear the resulting child wield a powerful hold on public emotion and literary imagination. The image is such a powerful one that its reverse of the pregnant woman having the baby violently torn from her womb is equally powerful and has not only surfaced in different kinds of stories and literature, but has inspired violence that physically carries out this fantastical trope in armed ethnic conflict all over the world. The power of the trope of the woman's body as territory, the sowing or reaping of babies upon it, and the violence that accompanies both seems to grant to this symbolism a kind of universal, timeless truth. However, as I've noted, it is this very truth that needs dismantling and deconstructing. Were this symbolism to be stripped from it, the woman's body would be less vulnerable to violence of this kind. Exploiting the trope in the absence of such dismantling amounts to that body being abused twice over, both times in the service of an ideology that the authors of these texts most certainly repudiate. Allende and Coetzee, for instance, are both writers whose fiction and politics I otherwise admire and sympathize with. As far as one can critically tell, they're not in sympathy with the inscription of the woman's body as territory, possession, honor, or whatever other patriarchal ideology it is made symbolic of. Quite the opposite. Through their fiction, they seek to expose and decry such an inscription of the woman's body. And so I ask myself, how does this happen? How do writers such as these become complicit in the very crime that they seek to expose and decry? What compulsions make it possible for otherwise intelligent literary minds to fall prey to the use of politically dangerous analogies such as these? So, in order to answer this somewhat odd question, I think we need to think about the nature of violence, its resistance to language, and the writer's dilemma in finding a narrative for it. The primary compulsion of events of extreme violence is their demand for narrative and representation. Yet, as Elaine Scarry and others have pointed out, the nature of violence is such that it denies any possible casting into language. The pain of violence, Scarry argues, is essentially inarticulable. So when even pure description is, by virtue of the necessary medium of language, less than pure, the abandoning of analogy often transforms itself into what Lawrence Langer calls the quest for analogy. The quest for analogy, he says, whether by literary artist or historian, is the task that bedevils anyone aiming to initiate the imagination of an audience into the singular realm of the unthinkable. Unquote. The inarticulable nature of violence is such that its narratives are always double-edged. As Carey says, quote, the moment it is lifted out of its ironclad privacy of the body into speech, it immediately falls back in. Nothing alerts us to the place it has vacated. Invisible in part because of its resistance to language, it is also invisible because its own powerfulness ensures its isolation, ensures that it will not be seen in the context of other events, that it will fall back from its new arrival into language and remain devastating. Its absolute claim for acknowledgement contributes to its being ultimately unacknowledged. Close quotes. When cast into language or otherwise narrativized, Scarry claims, the invisibility of pain is wrought first by omission and again by its active redescription. The analogic language found for events of violence transfers the reality of pain and violence onto another reality, erasing the event rather than bringing it into being in language. I would argue further that therefore redescription can be seen as a more active form of omission and omission as an extreme form of redescription, where the fact of violence is so enfolded into the language that its presence cannot even be sensed beneath it. Placed in this context, finding an analogy for events of violence is imperative as well as impossible. And the writer is always at risk of reinscribing the violenced body in the act of description. This reinscription is so enfolded into the language that it becomes possible for otherwise intelligent literary minds to use the analogy of the violenced woman to figure forth extreme violence and yet be blinded to the material reality within which this analogy operates. So at this point, it's useful to distinguish between realist and non or magic realist narratives of violence. For instance, while Coetzee's novel is realist, the rape itself is left to the imagination. It's entirely unnarrated. And while Allende's novel is magic realist, the violence done to Alba is narrated in a very realist, very graphic manner. So how do these distinctions help us interrogate the issue at hand? Responding to the dilemma of the inarticulacy of violence and its simultaneous demand for narrative, Veena Das suggests that it is in the register of the imaginary that we can recover the narratives of violence. Here, the seemingly unnegotiable schism between the material body and the metaphorical or analogic text can be bridged because it responds, I quote, to the pain of the other, which not only asks for a home in language, but also seeks a home in the body. The relationship between the real and the imaginary evolves, Das says, from the relationship between speaking and hearing, and between building a world that the living can inhabit with their loss, and building a world in which the dead can find a home. It is possible to argue that it is in this register of the imaginary that Toni Morrison, whom I will come to later, among others, situates her narratives of violence, that she employs anti-realist or magic realist tropes in order to generate the visceral energy of signification. And finally, that the terror that is the affect of this energy is harnessed in the destruction rather than the construction of the collective identity formation that these women's bodies are inscribed with. So let's take a minute to think this through. The construction of any identity, collective or individual, requires a high degree of agency. But as we have seen, the inarticulacy of the violence body is countered by its self-referentiality. It can signify nothing other than itself. Thus, although it derives its iconic status from this ability to bear witness to itself and the event of violence, it is denied any signifying agency. It cannot, in other words, be signified through language or narrative. Saadat Hussain Manto acknowledges the inarticulacy inherent in such violence, claiming that his stories struggle with, even as they illustrate, the manner in which bodily mutilation results in the permanent mutilation of language. However, Manto looks forward to a time when, I quote, the capacity to signify will be recovered. Veena Das, however, points out that ownership and control of the body can be recovered in the mind, and as her reading of the narratives of women surviving the partition shows, this too is a form of agency. Soon after Urvashi Bhuttaria began research into the fate of the women who were abducted during the partition, India celebrated its 50th year of independence. In 1997, amidst the celebrations and the strong strand of sorrow and horror that memorialized the violence of the partition, Ashish Nandi began a concerted effort to find and document the aging survivors and their stories. He and his research team found, to their surprise, that not only were survivors reluctant to speak to them, they had never spoken of these events, even to their own children and families. The dense and deep silence that surrounded the event seemed unbreachable. Being sociologists, of course, Nandi and his team were intrigued, and after some persuasion, people not only opened up to them about their experiences, they also explained why they felt the compulsion for silence. For many, the instinctive feeling was that there was no language with which to speak of such events. Some voiced fears of setting the forces of evil into motion again if they were to speak its name. In her reading of survivor narratives of riots and ethnic violence, Veena Das unearths the notion put forward by several women that they remained silent in an effort to contain the terror of the violence they had witnessed and been subject to. The metaphor used is an interesting one. The women speak of themselves as vessels which remain filled with the poison they have drunk and which they dare not let escape. They see themselves as being pregnant with this terrible knowledge, but never allowed to release this knowledge into the world. It is through this rather different analogy of pregnancy and their bodies that these women are able to wrest control over their own bodies and acquire a species of agency from this power. This agency is one that resides in their minds, Das says, and through which women regain control over their own bodies. It is interesting for our purposes to see this refusal to give birth as an act of agency, as against the two examples that I gave of agreeing to give birth that we saw in Ayende's and Kutsia's work. Interestingly, also for our purposes, this reluctance to give birth or bring into being a knowledge which will then acquire a horrifying, destructive life of its own is closely akin to the belief cited in some of Nandi's interviews with partition survivors that the act of languaging violence is also an act of bringing it into physical being. This idea is intriguing for many reasons. Apart from the connection it draws between articulation and literal being, it seems to suggest that the violenced body or the act of violence itself is always already in existence. That is, for both the female survivors who see themselves as harboring it as a living body within their bodies, as well as for the survivors of partition, the event and body exist in what has been called durational time. Lawrence Langer's notion of durational time is formulated specifically with reference to Holocaust survivors, although I've extended its use. The term refers to the unique sense of time experienced by survivors of such events, whereby a linear understanding of time is disrupted by the event of violence. Thus, the event exists within a frame of temporal referentiality all of its own. It does not exist in the past, against which a sense of present or future can be postulated. The survivor exists within this durational time, even as she simultaneously exists within a traditional system of linear time. And thus, the violence as event or body is always there, always alive. Hence the fear that the act of speech will render it physically forth and perhaps unleash the same forces again. So, seen within this larger theoretical context, our question might be rephrased. Is it not inevitable that when the violenced woman's body is presented in fiction, it will almost of certainty reproduce the terrible ideologies that incite violence against it. So, in answer to this, I would like to offer a reading of an instance of the use of rape and pregnancy where the reinscription of the once abused body has been avoided. And it is in Toni Morrison's Beloved. Seen in the context of the theoretical framework I've outlined, Morrison's use of this analogy is an interesting one. When Sethe's long dead daughter Beloved appears, Morrison is at pains to specify her physical existence. I believe that in Beloved's pregnancy, which saps Sethe's life and is eventually exorcised, destroying Beloved and releasing Sethe from her hold, the metaphor of women pregnant with a poison which cannot be delivered is given a literal life and functions in a manner similar to that narrated by Das's survivors. What is the poison that Beloved is pregnant with? In his work on the Holocaust, Dory Law points to the efficacy of the Nazi system of indoctrination of otherness. The Nazi system, he says, was foolproof in the sense that it convinced its victims that what was affirmed about their otherness and their inhumanity was correct, and that their experiences were no longer communicable even to themselves and perhaps never took place. Unquote. There are many poisons that have twisted Paul D's red heart into a sealed tobacco tin, and we're shown in various ways the horrors of slavery, brutality, and dehumanization that he keeps shut away inside this tin that we are told has rusted shut. The loss of Hale's mind, rendered animal by school teachers' violence inflicted on Sethe, and his own dehumanization at the hands of the slave owners are shut and sealed away so that Paul D can continue to live. This hidden knowledge of hate and violence is the poison that is released into the physical, into Beloved's womb, where it finds a body and physical existence that will one day be released into the world. In Morrison's text, then, the unspeakable and the inarticulable finds a physical manifestation within Beloved's womb. Significantly, the episode where Beloved is raped is highly ambiguous, cast as it is in a non-realist mold. Indeed, it's quite possible to read the episode as the rape of Paul D, even while the narrative is wreathed in the trappings of the supernatural. While it remains a rape of some kind, it avoids the trope of rape used by Allende and Coetzee. Similarly, the unborn child does not herald a looked-for future. As Beloved's resulting pregnancy progresses, it is clear that it is life-sapping rather than a life-giving force. It literally draws Sethe's life from her, making her thinner and thinner as Beloved gets bigger and bigger until her daughter Denver, fearing for her mother's health and her own, reaches out to the women of her community. The famous episode of the women humming and the disappearance or destruction of Beloved too is ambiguous in many ways, but it makes clear the fact that the poison or destructive power of Beloved was exorcised, much in the way that evil spirits are believed to be. Once this exorcism is achieved, healing can begin, and Morrison leaves us with the process of regeneration underway. So the case of Beloved is instructive, I think, in that it offers us an instance of the use of the woman's body as analogy without falling into the trap of abusing it twice by reinscribing it within the patriarchal systems which make its abuse possible in the first place. And in doing so, I believe that Morrison exercises her agency to the writer, making it possible to create fictional characters through whom the patriarchal inscription is acknowledged in order to be unwritten. Her characters choose different inscriptions for their bodies, repurposing the violence done to them as Sethe does with the tree on her back, or Beloved does through her pregnancy. Does fiction have a social responsibility? Shouldn't writers, especially fabulous ones, have the right to write their own truth? Should the compulsions of material reality be urged upon their literary imagination? These are questions that each writer must decide for themselves, of course. Personally, I find it impossible to dismiss these as mere literary metaphors and images, fiction that after all can do what it likes because it is only fiction. For all the women whose bodies have undergone violence, it is imperative that we see that the body cannot be abused twice in the service of a purely literary agency. So I've spoken at length as an academic, but I'm here also today as a writer. And I want to end with a mini rant about how hard it is to get the academic in my head to shut up while the fantasy or sci-fi writer is trying to craft pure entertainment. Why does fantasy have to have violence? This annoying academic asks. Aren't you afraid your book will lack gravitas if there is not at least one terrifying account of graphic violence in it? Physical violence is by definition a spectacle, and spectacle is by definition a thing to be consumed, which is the true meaning of entertainment. You know this? The reasonable academic reminds the confused writer and scoffs, no wonder your books don't sell like the Hunger Games or George Martin's. Or this, what? Your heteronormative cis-identifying heroine is going to be young and beautiful with a perfect body and superpowers? Seriously? You're trusting the saving of the world to a hormone-fueled teenager when reality all around you is shouting at you that the real warriors are overweight middle-aged women with backaches and not enough money. So then the harassed writer needs to put down the pen and figure out how to represent violence without producing it as spectacle for entertainment. How to create a villain that the reader will hate viscerally without having that villain indulge in gut-wrenching violence. How to convey the gravitas of war and conflict without graphic accounts of that war. The writer grumbles and curses and decides not to use the woman's body as metaphor for absolutely everything from pleasure to joy to anxiety to fear. The writer shakes her fist at the academic who smugly announces that if you took the woman's body out of the artist's reach, then that artist would really have to work her imagination to find suitable images for any and all human emotions. The writer resigns herself to losing a sizable chunk of readership when the nubile and desirable body is replaced by the sturdy and middle-aged one. And so it goes. Agency is a cruel gift to give a writer because the process of granting that agency to vulnerable bodies in her fiction is difficult and dangerous and very necessary. I promised that the rant would be a small one, and so I will end here. Thank you all so much for listening.